Welcome to Crypto Sapiens, a show that hosts lively discussions with innovative Web3 builders to help you learn about decentralized money systems, including Ethereum, Bitcoin, and DeFi. The podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and it is not financial advice. Crypto Sapiens is presented in partnership with Bankless DAO, a movement for pioneers seeking freedom from the limitations of the traditional financial system. Bankless DAO will help the world go bankless by creating user-friendly on-ramps for people to discover decentralized financial technologies through education, media, and culture.
Welcome to Decentralized, where we explore the social layer of decentralized science. What does it mean to decentralize science? My name is Elijah, and in this series, we'll consider the fundamental aspects of science as a social activity and an institution through the lens of various contributors in the DeSci space. The first 4 episodes are published as a mini-series and lay the groundwork for future conversations. Our goal is to facilitate an exchange of ideas between people working on the solutions to these fundamental problems. Let's start the show.
I'm amped. I'm excited for this conversation. It's something we've been kind of dancing around the past 3 episodes, and glad to really address the issue head on. So thank you again for our speakers joining today, Savva, Jelani, and Erik. And we've got Clinamenic, who's now I see with the Lobby 3 account up. And today we're going to be focusing on science as a public good. Is it a public good? I think we're probably all in alignment on that from speaking with you all previously. But how can we really we're address the practicalities of that today. Speakers, if you'd like to give a brief introduction. I know you've all been on here before, but this is a new topic, and if you have any opening thoughts, I'd love to get things kicked off.
So my name is Jelani. I am one of the core team members at DeSci World. I'm a scientist by training, neuroimmunologist, and avid crypto enthusiast for a few years now. And so I've been working at DeSci World for the last 6 months. If you don't know, DeSci World is seeking to be a one-stop shop for DeSci projects, an information aggregator that will help facilitate everybody's trajectories and travel through this wonderful space that we call DeSci. So we just want to make that a lot easier for everybody and signal boost projects, because we believe that this space is truly revolutionary to what we consider the paradigm of science. And just so we'll usher in hopefully a new paradigm, an open paradigm, one that truly supports the scientific innovation, as well as the individuals, scientists in this space, giving them an opportunity to really flourish both, mentally, financially, spiritually, and the like. So thanks for having me here.
Yeah, my name is Erik. I'm the head of operations and community at DeSci Labs. And at DeSci Labs, we are working to build the infrastructure behind science. So we have released our first product, DeSci Nodes, in alpha, and have quite a few people on making nodes at the moment. It is a research object protocol that allows all of the information behind a piece of knowledge, not just a PDF, but code, data, videos, PowerPoints, whatever it is that you want, to all be brought together on the same platform. So yeah, excited to be here. Thank you for hosting, and happy to talk about science as a public good.
Savva, would you like to go next?
Hi guys. So I'm from Crowdfunded Cures. My background is mainly commercial and IP law. I did my thesis on gaps in the patent system for drug development, basically where it's not possible to enforce a monopoly price because certain therapies are essentially public goods because they're available, the ingredients are available for very cheap. So things like repurposing off-patent drugs, nutraceuticals, diets, and psychedelics, plant medicines, things like that. So what we're looking to try and do is build a source of retroactive funding or crowdfunding, a source of retroactive funding, or you could think of it like a bounty for open source medicine, and also to help engage with governments and health insurers to basically enter these contractual agreements to basically pay for clinical trial data as a public good, so without reliance on patents.
And I'm glad you're able to join us here for this conversation as well, because we had you on for the previous one about funding and IP, but we did have an excellent conversation on the last episode about psychedelics and censorship, and so I'm sure that'll come back around this time. Clinamenic over on the Lobby 3 account, please do give another introduction to you and the work at Lobby 3 and how that's important here.
And first, thank you again for putting this together. I know we had a great conversation last time I was on this, so hoping to have another good one here. So Lobby 3 is an impact advocacy DAO, kind of founded by Andrew Yang and a core team of people. And we're kind of feeling out what that's like in the Web3 world. How are we going to be going about educating policymakers where a DAO and a DAO doing direct lobbying is still kind of ambiguous at this stage. But there are still other opportunities, like what we abstractly refer to as representing the Web3 community. We're building tools that will allow us to do that at this stage, or we're rather funding the development of certain tools that will allow us to do that. But we're on that front of like public advocacy within the Web3 space, specifically with a social impact, public goods kind of slant. And that's Lobby 3's angle coming in here. Specifically relating to DeSci, we're also a few Lobby 3 members, including Flowscience here. We've been involved in conversations about forming a group of DeSci leaders and practitioners to kind of be a center of gravity for advocacy-related conversations pertaining to DeSci technology. And so we've been a DeSci coalition so far. Here, Decentralized seems like it's a good platform for these kind of DeSci advocacy, public goods conversations.
You've been instrumental in organizing, getting that the DeSci coalition off the ground, and thank you for inviting me to that. It's been excellent conversations within that group, and I've been really enjoying what we're building towards over there. So glad to have you here again. And Adam, I see you joined us on the stage as well. So Adam was on the previous episode with talking about reputation and censorship. So if you'd like to give a brief introduction to yourself, and we'll kick things off here in a minute.
Good morning. I am currently running building SciDAO on the core team and looking to decentralize both access and the knowledge base around psychedelics, knowledge, and wisdom.
We've got a great panel today, very diverse speakers with different backgrounds, as you can tell. So I think we're going to have a really good dynamic conversation about this topic. And a little bit more of brief background about how we got here at this point in the conversation on Decentralized. So the first episode was about what is DeSci, which is very, very broad and general. We covered science as, in general, what is science, how to decentralize it, what does that mean, science as a social activity, concepts of refi and decentralized society, and really connect people, and essentially kind of like open sourcing it with, connecting the end users of science with the quote unquote developers, right? It's the actual scientists. And same thing with connecting scientists and citizens with funding, right? So that's kind of what the next two episodes, the last two were about, funding, IP, and ownership, and then reputation and censorship and publication and peer review. And so here we are, having covered all this, and now today we're discussing is, science as a public good. What does that mean? And so if science is a public good, to start things off, how do we align the individual incentives of participants in science, people doing it, with the collective good of having something as a public good that is accessible to everyone in that sense, and in the sense of having knowledge available, right? So not being behind paywalls, having publications, literally just accessible to people in a simple way. That's my question. How do we align those two interests, right? The larger collective and the individuals that are actually doing it. And I know, Erik, again, there's some great work on impact certificates and retroactive funding, but what are your personal perspectives on, this is open to anyone, the, sort of addressing this issue and really making science a public good? How can we actually get there?
Yeah, I mean, I can just kind of quickly kick us off. I think everything, and it's funny to see, but everything kind of tends to tie back together. So the immediate answer is funding. I think for starters, we need to be thinking regularly about the ways that we fund science and the pros and cons of each individual funding primitive that comes up. So, for example, impact certificates are one potential funding primitive for science that have pros and cons. Intellectual property is another funding primitive for science that has pros and cons. But any primitive that we use and any place that we plug it into a larger system of science will have adverse effects that we hadn't necessarily considered. So I think that the very first thing in making science a public good is being incredibly diligent about the ways that we are financializing science. So I will go ahead and say, I do believe that the greatest gift the DeSci space can give to academia is a sustainable business model for journals, a sustainable, non-extractive. So you currently have major journals which are taking 50% profit margins on pretty much every paper that gets published. And then on the other side, you have open access journals, which oftentimes have problems staying afloat because while their information is open, their journal itself, kind of the business model behind it, has some serious flaws at times, or they often do have flaws. It's about finding something in between the two of those that doesn't restrict access immediately. I think another thing that's worth considering is kind of the underlying infrastructure itself. So thinking about how we encode the principles of open access into the foundational digital technologies that kind of underlie the larger DeSci stack. And that is one that we're doing at DeSci Labs is trying to make sure that as much of the information as humanly possible is open and accessible to anyone who wants it. I think it's rethinking some of the technology behind the scenes and being very careful and deliberate about funding primitives that are out there. So, anyone have thoughts with regards to that?
One possible thing with any potential decentralized models for funding journals, and I think we've mentioned this, we touched on this during the Decentralized talk that I was last part of, and it was also maybe covered in the recent Twitter space between JournoDAO and DeSci World. But I think there could be some interesting territory to explore for decentralized editorial kind of boards or control models. Again, I'm not sure how much precedent there really is at this stage. I know that the tools that we're exploring with JournoDAO are kind of moving in this direction, but I'm not quite sure if we're at that point yet. I guess I'm wondering what the trade-offs would be if we decentralize editorial control, still be susceptible to whales. The quick point is that there could be potentially some business model where you can like tokenize and distribute editorial control as a way of raising funds, and then that can allow for the content itself to not be without paywalls, but maybe you incur some other kind of downsides there as well.
Tokenizing, right? And that's what it comes down to is, I think, Web3, right? Decentralizing this governance of the process, I think it has a huge potential to it. And there was something I shared a talk, a presentation basically about kind of doing that beforehand. And I'll share that link in the comments here in a minute. But yeah, really the ability to open up this publishing chain, and that's sort of what Erik was talking about with impact certificates. So I guess I'll try and give a brief overview of what my interpretation of that is, just to give a little background for anybody who's not familiar with the concept of an impact certificate. It is basically just it's an on-chain record of that allows sort of, I guess, a quantitative evaluation of somebody's contribution to science, and so it's kind of like a citation that can be traced on chain. But sort of, I guess, allows some sort of quantitative or even qualitative estimation of that impact. So, Erik, if you can clarify a little bit more just what that looks like.
So I'm a huge fan of impact certificates in the context that they're a novel funding primitive that we haven't seen before. I think that there are a ton of design considerations which still need to be very carefully weighed. So not saying it's a perfect, flawless system. Just want to start out with that disclaimer, but that it's interesting and thought-provoking. The gist of an impact certificate is that it gives a scientist the ability to accrue funding throughout the entire life cycle of a project. So you get funding at the beginning, you get funding through the middle of the project, and you can get funding at the end. And that's very different from a lot of original, I guess, traditional funding primitives. Like with intellectual property, you're going to get funding exclusively at the end of the project. With grants, you're going to get funding exclusively at the beginning of the project. And finding different ways to allocate money and kind of keep it flowing in is definitely unique. So what an impact certificate actually is. It's a larger part of an impact market, but the idea is that you would have, let's say, a large philanthropist or an organization like corporation kind of thing that want to see a specific impact come about in the world. Let's say it's a corporation that is passionate about biotech research, or it's a philanthropist who's passionate environmental disasters, right? They could donate a pool of money. Let's say they were willing to give $5 million, $10 million, $100 million, whatever it actually is, towards funding research in that specific area. Any team could spin up and release an impact certificate and basically say, hey, we're going to try and solve this. At the end, what they're all fighting for is that $100 million pool. But that impact certificate, that NFT, can be traded back and forth between organizations and speculators. So that NFT represents their stake in the project. If their project is selected by whoever put down the money at the beginning to win the retroactive prize pool, whoever's holding that NFT would essentially get that money, right? So what's interesting here is the fact that you enable speculation on kind of market dynamics to come into play on science itself, while still being able to isolate individual scientists from some of that speculation. So if I start out with 1,000 different projects that each have an impact certificate that they've spun up, 900 of them are going to fall by the wayside almost immediately. Someone can buy that impact. The money goes directly to the scientist towards funding science. But then as you start to narrow down the field, each one of those impact certificates becomes more and more valuable. It gets traded back and forth. Every single time that it gets traded, moving towards the end goal of that retroactive pool of funding, a percentage cut goes directly into the pocket of the scientist, of the lab who's actually doing the research. And through this, you can trade back and forth, trying to identify, using market dynamics to try and identify who would eventually end up with that retroactive funding pool, all the meanwhile putting cash into the pockets of scientists.
Super cool. Yeah, no, Jelani, please go take it next. I was going to say that's a very interesting approach. It sounds like a comprehensive sort of model, and I'd love to hear what the other sort of approaches are to, or comments on that are as well. So Jelani, please take it away.
So Erik, I think it has a lot of potential in terms of helping provide, alternative ways to go about funding. So definitely a pain point in science is funding. But I think a pain point specifically for science as a public good is not so much the funding, but where the funding comes from and the strings attached to said funding. So with regards to the impact NFT or impact certificate, is it just as susceptible to, let's say, big pharma or heavily invested whale regulating exactly what can be shared from that data that is generated from that prize pool? And how does it address that? Because I think that's, to me personally, that's one of the underpinnings that limits science as a public good, right? It is control of what is expressed and what is out there for the public to view.
Fantastic question. And this is the one that I continue to ask myself. There's a fine line between science and research and development, which gets confused so often. Some of the most incredible discoveries that have ever been made over the course of human history came from just kind of general grant money thrown at a brilliant person without a specific direction to move in. So it's kind of the financialization of science that turns it into research and development, and that's very much kind of what you're talking about with the strings attached here. I think finding quality systems to fund that discovery as opposed to specific targeted innovation is difficult. I do think that impact certificates can move science in a positive direction there as compared to other funding sources. So, one of the things that is powerful is the fact that there is a level of separation between the funders and the exact results of the project, which is done through these market dynamics. So, yes, let's say I pick a company, Monsanto wants to do something involving gene editing, right? Instead of funding a specific research project with a specific goal, they can say, we are passionate about this one specific aspect of gene editing. Here's $20 million to whoever can come up with the solution to this problem, or whoever's willing to do incredible research on this. It gives a lot more flexibility for a scientist to actually pursue their own pathway as opposed to being explicitly directed from the beginning. So, yeah.
This is Adam. Can I jump in on this?
Yeah.
One of the challenges with this is that when you're doing research, in order to identify the win conditions in a way that's not gamifiable, you have it's hard to predict a discovery before it's made. That's the definition of a discovery, or at least like a breakthrough discovery. So identifying the win conditions is really difficult. Like the way XPRIZE does it is they have a committee that determines it, right? But then you're right, that's not in alignment with a code is law situation. So my concern is that most large organizations that are capable of putting up a 20 or $100 prize are not going to want to give up the ability to authenticate that information, and then you're basically right back where we started. That's not my not helpful concern about this whole thing.
No, that's fair. What do you mean by authenticate the information?
Well, who determines the victory condition for the $20 million incentive prize in this scenario?
Oh, okay. So who determines impact? How do we measure impact?
Exactly. And if you understand the situation well enough to determine the impact before you've started, then it's not a discovery.
In the healthcare space, we've got some very unique tools out there that can be used to measure impact, like clinical outcomes in a clinical trial. Obviously, if your clinical trial results in improved clinical outcomes versus usual care, then that is some very real impact, and that's linked to clinical trial data. So I think medicine has a lot of opportunities here, with particular medical clinical trial data. There's another measure called a quality adjusted life year, although it's somewhat subjective. That's basically how health insurers, or at least, single payers, mainly kind of outside of the US, assess the value of a new drug. They just determine, okay, how many quality adjusted life years does this drug add on average, and then they're willing to pay, say, $30,000 per quality. So, I think we do have existing tools to measure impact in certain niches, but I agree with Adam that the incentives, the design of the criteria for an outcome payment is extremely important, and obviously you want to prevent gaming and things. But these things are a growing area. There's a lot of interest in particularly innovation prizes. So the U.S. government now has something called the America Competes Act, where the federal agencies are allowed to authorize incentive innovation prizes up to 100 million or 50 million, I think, without Congress approval. So it's an actively there's probably active research, or hopefully, in this area. And if Web3 can sort of take some initiative in this space, I think that would be really interesting, and particularly because of the fact that with Web3 you can talk about coin market caps of $1 billion and raising hundreds of millions of dollars in 30 seconds. So we sort of have the technology. It's just about finding the right use case.
Yeah, I just had one possible solution to the problem Adam brought up about who arbitrates victory conditions for these kind of grant-like disbursements. And this gets at something that Jelani, Flowscience, and I talked about in the first Decentralized session, is that it seems like gatekeeping is still necessary at certain checkpoints or milestones here. I mean, I'm not speaking as a scientist, I'm speaking sort of as an outside observer here. But that process, that like action or that step, that mechanism of gatekeeping can to some extent be decentralized. So in lieu of any objective kind of like smart contract conditions for what qualifies a disbursement, if you have a fund that has tokenized voting power over it, you can have essentially a DAO vote for whether or not research qualifies kind of disbursement. That could be one solution for this.
I think the risk of that is it's actually the mechanism for retroactive public goods funding, where basically they decide afterwards, the DAO kind of decides how much this particular innovation is worth. I think the advantage is the flexibility. The disadvantage is this kind of, it's basically like it's called an interim clause, where essentially you're at the mercy of the DAO, so you have to kind of assume that everyone's going to play fair. I'm more of a fan of setting out the criteria in advance, and if you meet the criteria like a contract, like if you bridge, then you get $100 billion or $100 million or whatever. It shouldn't be up to a DAO whether you fulfilled the specifications or not of the bridge. However, the flexibility of a sort of a DAO arrangement is good, but as long as the DAO members are fair and they're not kind of going to sort of gyp the investors that have paid so much money for this innovation at the last mile.
At the end of the day, someone's got to make the call, right? It's either going to be code or a DAO or a state actor or a whale or an institution. But like someone's got to determine, yes, this bridge was built to spec, yes or no.
Usually you would set out the specs in advance and sign a contract, and there would be, if there was any deviation from that, there would be sort of change control. But if there's too much flexibility around payouts, then I think the whole house of cards falls down, because you might not have a investor actually come in and want to invest on the basis of an uncertain outcome.
Okay, but back to the bridge. Okay, so someone has to like literally go out to a bridge. A physical human has to go out to a bridge and assess the steel was used. The appropriate brackets were used. Like that assessor is fundamentally a vulnerability. So you could pay the assessor off. You could civil attack that assessor. Like that's or the assessor is a corrupt politician. That's what I'm saying. There's always vulnerabilities in the system. So I guess what I'm saying is we have to be very careful about this up front.
I think that's actually a really great point. And one of the ways that I envision this, and whether it be practical or not, or pragmatic or not, is that, my definition of a public good is something that is open and accessible to as many people as possible, right? It should be easily accessible to all. And so making it such that we don't necessarily have, so in the ethos of decentralization, we don't need to have one person be the assessor, or at least have that information out to as many eyes as possible, is one way to kind of help combat this nature of privatization or corruptibility, right? So specific to me, above the impact certificate, I would argue that the DeSci nodes product that is being developed is more on par to what is considered open to a public good than not, right? And this, from just again, all from my own opinion, the idea here is that this comprehensive unit of knowledge that I hope and arguably would probably be open to everybody, allows an individual to get the full scope, or at least as comprehensive of a scope of whatever particular data point they're looking at in one hopefully digestible format. And having access to all of this information in one easy way, I think, is what is truly going to open up the concept of science as a public good, right? From a like an ease perspective, not having to go to nature and then back it up by going to some other source and some other source. Having it in one easy spot is one way. So that's just an ease of stream of information. And then again, providing it to people who will be the quote unquote gatekeepers or the evaluators, such that, to Savva and Adam's point, but also the layman. So the regular Joe Blow who is interested in the particular topic doesn't quite necessarily know, but has access to that same information and can therefore open it up for discussion. Again, discussion being a really important part in public goods and the characteristic of a public good. I see that tool, and funding is important too. That kind of information conveying tool speaks more to the impact of DeSci on science being a public good than necessarily the funding infrastructures that we're going to be using to then facilitate those future discoveries.
I could not agree with that more. I think that the DeSci nodes tool set is actually a huge part of how you enable science as a public good. And I think I kind of kicked us off by saying it's about the funding and it's about the infrastructure. So just want to 100% support that statement. I think it's not even a question of is the data open? Is the data organized well enough that people can find what they need? Is it findable? Is it accessible? Is it interoperable? Is it reusable? Some of these different questions around how we structure the data and how we make sure that the scientific ledger of record itself is owned and governed by the scientific community is absolutely critical. I don't think that we can make every single piece of science that's ever been made fully accessible to anyone who wants it. There are always going to be privacy restrictions. That's not a problem. But what we can do is make sure by actually just building it the right way, that the scientific ledger of record itself cannot be controlled by any singular individual, cannot be, I guess, gate-kept by anyone, that it is owned by the larger community. So just want to say yes, 100%. I think that the Nodes platform does more for open access than anything else that I've seen in the entirety of DeSci, and it's pretty awesome to get to work on. Thanks, Jelani.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the things that I'm doing in DeSci space is not necessary, but I think that, Molecule and their IP-NFT railway has somewhat not solved, but at least progressed the notion of funding science, which I think is fundamentally what everybody needs, right? Everybody needs to eat. Money is crucial. That's not what's going to solve science as a public good. I think DeSci Labs and its collaborators' view on these new units of knowledge, alongside Talent DAO and Scurf and other protocols that are looking at how to decentralize peer reviewing such that it's open to not just 3 peer reviewers as has been the archaic structure in the past, but widely spread across peers and of different fields and different backgrounds. This, I think, is what's going to add validity and credence, yes, like validity to the scientific realm, and also open it up to interpretation and discussion. I think one thing that has been lost a lot in the traditional scientific scheme is discussion on points that are important in terms of our infrastructure and our progression in science, right? Data being siloed and being hidden prohibits inherently the discussion, or at least a comprehensive and true discussion in determining what is worth pursuing, what is not worth pursuing, how do we solve these issues and how do we not solve these issues, and also inherently combats the concept of misinformation, right? I think, and Flo, I wanted to speak to you about this in terms of a concept for a potential other series, but ethics, right? Ethics in DeSci, I think, is going to be a large topic. I've brought this up previously. And it's going to impact the notion of science as a public good, right? Opening up science to everybody, providing information to everybody. And you're right, certain things have to be kept private, but what is kept private? And how do we balance privacy and the concept? How do we balance privacy with the concept of public good being completely open? I think these are all interesting topics that we're going to have to face if we are going to champion this notion of science as a public good within this space.
Yeah, that's a really big point. And within our last couple of minutes here, I wanted to bring up the concept of something back actually Eric brought up earlier was this distinction between research or science and R&D, research and development. I think, like maybe like applied science and we've got basic research and publishing things, via IP NFTs, like if we're publishing manuscripts or data right on a DeSci node, and that data becomes available as basic research. But at what level, is, if somebody's commercializing that, or what level, where do we sort of draw the line in terms of incentivizing, or to include those things, in terms of like licensing? Luckily we have Savva on the panel here, who maybe can provide some expertise in this answer. But like in terms of, should all science be like licensed with a CC0 like license? Should there be some sort of incentive there to continue promoting this decentralization and access all the way up the chain or out into the applied world?
From my perspective, I just see things as terms of contracts, and it's all basically incentives all the way down. Even with open source, people are incentivized to publish their contribution, and they get some kudos from the community. And you've got academics are incentivized to publish or perish. So and those incentives are different in open source versus, say, the closed source, where your incentives might be, okay, we've got the right to exclude others from access to this information, and we can charge a royalty and things like that. So there is this traditional tension between open source and when we kind of move to closed source, and typically it tends to be that basic science is like the open source stuff, and then eventually when you get to applied translational science, it's closed source. But you can actually create models where you can open source the applied stuff and just pay it out, like do a buyout. And this is where I think crypto and the funding things, sorry to bring it out to the funding, but I think the infrastructure is super important. But the infrastructure that allows people to sort of, raise $50 million to buy the US Constitution, which on the record I think is ridiculous. But imagine if we could raise like X number of dollars to open source nature, and have the community then as a community decide how to run it and edit it, and it becomes, and they decide it's going to be an open source journal. And so, these sorts of things I think are, different ways of thinking about incentives and funding. I think is that's quite powerful around Web3 but yeah, we're infinitely flexible how we can design smart contracts. It's really just about deciding what we want to do with it.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Does anybody else have any other thing to chime in? I think that's perfect, because the infinite flexibility of smart contracts, and that I think really is where I'm sort of settling on it too. Is it's there has to be a balance and sort of this alignment between the people who are doing the funding, the people who are doing the work, and the people who are end up using the results of the research products themselves, and that ultimately is going to be different in different situations. So having that flexibility is crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also like to second that emphasis on the infrastructure, because, I mean, speaking as an outsider as far as peer review is concerned, in general, I kind of see that kind of centralized decision making, because it's easier to come to a consensus with fewer people than with more people. I kind of see that as like an organizational tractor. And if we're talking about changing attractors, then that almost necessarily means we're talking about changing infrastructure. And so I think a lot of it comes down to the tools that we're using to make coming to nuanced consensus more feasible for larger numbers of people. That seems like really that's something we would almost have to contend with if we wanted to change this.
100%. Governance is the most interesting thing about, it's DAOs and governance technology. It's amazing.
Yeah, I just want to come in and say I agree with that. I think that there's a lot of power behind it. I think that there is also a lot of power behind just generic blockchain technology, and the fact that we can make things permanent and immutable. The fact that we can actually take a lot of these underlying concepts in science, like the ledger of record, and control them through code and governance as such. One of the things that I'm excited to see is how governance continues to evolve in the space. I think it's been really powerful to go from initial experimentation with like coin voting, one coin, one vote, to some of the things that other protocols are doing now, like, for example, Optimism's bicameral legislation and how they're handling governance on chain. I think that that is absolutely fantastic and something that we should be striving for more as a space. Another thing to kind of consider is how we handle governance at this earliest stage, because quite frankly, the people who should be governing science, governing some of the protocols, the DAOs underneath the hood, should be scientists. And at this point, scientists are not in Web3. So, how do we deal with that conundrum that we need governance at the earliest stage, but the ultimate folks who should be governing the system aren't here yet to help out? So, that's another interesting question that I've been grappling with for a little while. Would love to hear any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that, because I think the DeSci space is not fragmented but compartmentalized into different aspects: funding, infrastructure, and then community. And community being, not just people who are here, but how do we onboard more people? And that's specifically the mission at DeSci World: is how do we make it such that it is not just appealing but easy for non-Web3 natives to then enter into the space? And we think in a lot of the products that we're developing, right? And so one of our main initiatives that we've taken on now is directly reaching out to and trying to collaborate with universities to push back with the ivory tower mentality. But if not those, then internal structures of universities like student organizations and the like. And they have been a lot more receptive to this notion of this cool new, not really hip, but this cool new structure or paradigm that is growing in science, and they have a lot more eyes and willingness to interact with them. And so we on our own end are exploring ways to incentivize, not just collaborate, but incentivize, onboarding of students, onboarding of this nascent population of scientists who, I think everybody can agree to the fact that most revolutions are not started by the old guard, right? They profit from what's already existing, but it's from the new individuals in the space. And so these nascent scientists, I think, are a major focus. And as of so far, they seem very interested. And I think the issue here with DeSci, to Erik's point, is that it's just to us, it seems like big and shiny and new. But if you step outside of DeSci and you speak with people, it's relatively unheard of, right? Like, anecdotally, Vitalik, whom somebody in our team spoke with, is not even really up and up on the idea of what DeSci serves as a purpose, right? And this is a major individual in the Web3 space. So think about outside of the Web3 space, we're unheard of. I think organically people will filter in, and scientists especially, because we are solving problems that we deal with, I specifically as a scientist deal with on the daily. I think that it's really just the information. They just need to hear about us. They need to hear about us, and we need to find a way to make it palatable to them in such a way that they want to participate and they see the value. And, scientists inherently are creative, or at least, usually are creative, and they can theory craft the ultimate end goal that might come from seeing just a little bit of information of what's being created in DeSci. I'm going to bring it back to, because Erik, you're here. The DeSci nodes, I think, excites every scientist that I've ever spoken to and that I've ever kind of shilled the project to are like amazing, So it's just information.
Honestly, it's fun to showcase like the Nodes platform. I genuinely enjoy showing it to Web 2 skeptics of blockchain because they immediately come back at me and they're like, wait, you can do that? I'm like, yeah, we can do that. There's actual power behind this technology, I promise. And it's a great onboarding point for some of these other, like, for example, primitives like IP NFTs. I think it's a great way to get people into the space and just get excitement about what this can actually be. So I completely agree with you on that. It is a blast to get to showcase the nodes. That's my favorite part of my job.
I've got to get in there. I think I'm on the waiting list, but I've been putting out a manuscript that is my test data set, and so I'd love to talk with you, Erik, about potentially getting that on the nodes. But yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. I think we are really addressing a lot of these major issues in ways, and this pluralistic approach, this Web3 approach of trying new things. It's an experiment, right? And that's the best part. I think that I really enjoy about DeSci is it's a giant experiment in Web3 in general.